With its enduring popularity, unforgettable scenes, and famous lines, Casablanca has earned its place among cinematic legends. Would you believe me if I said there was a pivotal scene that may have altered the course of events? Something that was shot, argued about, and then forgotten about. If it was removed, why? Does it contain any hidden truths? We must return to the origins in order to fully comprehend what we are about to reveal. Murray Burnett and his wife went on a European vacation in 1938. An adventure that altered the course of his life. They witnessed the growing tide of anti-Semitism firsthand in Vienna. And they were profoundly disturbed by what they saw. Murray never forgot that encounter. After returning, he and his literary partner Joan Allison collaborated to transform those feelings into a narrative. A drama concerning migrants fleeing war-torn Europe emerged as the outcome. Everybody comes to Rick's, they said. The play had everything. Thrilling, dramatic, and romantic. It never happened to make it to Broadway. After that, the past intervened. On December 8, 1941, the day following Pearl Harbor, the script was discovered by Stephen Carnell at Warner Brothers. After a few days, he approached Helbia Wallace, the studio chief, and said, "This might be something." The rights were purchased by the studio for $20,000 by December 27. Everyone goes to Rick's and fits right in since patriotism is flying high. It was merely another project to Warner Brothers. Just a simple film that they intended to make for less than $1 million, nothing fancy. While making adjustments, the picture maintained the majority of the original cast and storyline. Lisbon, the final port of call for refugees attempting to reach the United States, was the setting of the original drama. Although the screenwriters were fond of the location, producer Helbia Wallace had other ideas. To him, Casablanca was the best. It would soon become apparent why that decision was made. The film's director was in for a surprise from Hal Wallace. William Wyler was his first priority. Then he made an attempt to obtain Friday, the girlfriend of Rio Bravo's accomplice Howard Hawks. Hawks, however, was preoccupied with Sergeant York at the time. Thus, Michael Curtis was hired, a man with a track record of success including Captain Blood, Angels with Dirty Faces, and The Adventures of Robin Hood. Wallace informed Warner Brothers chief of casting Steve Trilling in a memo dated February 14, 1942, that Humphrey Bogart and Sheridan would be the featured actors. The studio, however, had been generating excitement for some time. They informed The Hollywood Reporter on January 5 that Sheridan, Dennis Morgan, Ronald Reagan, and George Raft would all be appearing in the film. Whatever about Raft? The part was already passed over by him. Concerning the reports regarding Reagan? Not at all true. Meanwhile, he was in America. He was a member of the Cavalry Reserve before production ever began. A few days later, the producers felt the female protagonist should be European, thus Ilsa Lund was chosen instead of Lois Meredith. And Sheridan was thus no longer an appropriate choice. Ingrid Bergman was the first actress that sprang to mind for the screenwriters. On set for a movie for MGM mogul David O. Selznick, the attractive Swedish actress was already causing a stir in Hollywood. A glitch, nevertheless, did exist. It was clear that Selznick was having a hard time releasing Bergman. He and Bergman had hoped she would play Maria in For Whom the Bell Tolls, but the part went to Vera Zorina. Even though Bergman wasn't a huge fan of the plot, it didn't bother her too much. Warner Brothers and MGM finally reached an agreement. In exchange for sending Olivia de Havilland to MGM, Warner Brothers rented out Bergman for 8 weeks to film Casablanca. America had transformed by the time production on Casablanca began in 1942. More and more people were speaking out against Hitler. Everyone was in agreement. After America's entry into World War II, Hollywood went into full war mode, producing pictures to boost morale and aid the war effort. The anti-Nazi propaganda machine at Warner Brothers was cranked up a notch. 4 of the 11 pictures they were producing at the time were war films, including Casablanca, according to a trade publication from May 1942. Now we get to the crazy part. They began filming on May 25, even though the script was not yet complete. The movie's ending was a mystery to everyone. The main actors got themselves into a jam because the first scene they shot was a Parisian flashback. The role of the enamored lover wasn't really a fit for Humphrey Bogart, who played Rick Blaine. What about Ingrid Bergman? When it came to her character, she was completely lost. It was unclear to her whether Ilsa should have fallen in love with Rick or Victor Laszlo due to the lack of a finished script. Michael Curtis, the director, also lacked an adequate response, so he issued her a straightforward directive: act as if she was uncertain about it herself. Bogart was having trouble with more than simply his role. The man's private life was a tumbleweed. Behind the scenes, he was experiencing marital strife with Mayo Method. Despite Ingrid Bergman's best efforts, he was never interested in eating out with her. He preferred to play chess by himself on set and avoided attention. He made matters worse by ignoring Bergman unless the cameras were rolling. Others believe his height was a factor, while some attribute it to the stress he was experiencing. While Bergman stood at 5 feet 10 inches, Bogart was 5 feet 8 inches. For that, Hollywood had a trick. Whenever they were on screen together in Casablanca, he had to use an apple box as a prop to make her stare up at him. The chemistry between them was palpable on television. Off-screen, it's not as notable. When they were out to lunch with their common acquaintance, that was the one occasion they got along. Playwright Geraldine Fitzgerald. Surprisingly, they were both of the opinion that the film would be a financial failure. Screenwriter Howard Koch was hired to assist bring everything together by refining the finale, developing Rick's backstory, and honing the relationship. In his telling, Rick became an even more ragtag underdog, a guy who had smuggled guns to Ethiopia and fought for the loyalists in Spain. One of Rick's most memorable words is "I don't buy or sell human beings," which Rick uses to reject Ferrari's offer to acquire Sam. However, the script was constantly evolving even during filming. Directly on set, new pages were being distributed to the performers. Koch, the Epstein brothers, and they all worked on separate versions, sometimes modifying each other's work, but never collaborating on a single version. When filming started in May 1942, the script was still unwritten. Writers Julius and Philip Epstein had to hurry up and finish the tale while adhering to all the rigid Hollywood standards of the period. There was no wiggle room for censorship when Casablanca was being made. In subsequent interviews, Julius Epstein said that the writers were essentially restrained by the regulations. Something as basic as depicting a woman who has recently gone through a divorce? Not to be touched. But they did their best to break new ground wherever they could. At last they could yell "hell no!" but not too loudly. Determining the conclusion was a major source of stress. Evident from the production code was one thing: Rick would never leave Ilsa behind. Married life was hers. That concluded it. So the tale goes, while cruising down Sunset Boulevard, the Epstein brothers both lost it and decided to call in the usual suspects. That was the spark that ignited the ending. Rick is able to leave Ilsa and move away since Captain Renault covered up the murder. Meanwhile, the government was closely monitoring the entertainment industry. To ensure the general population was kept informed about the war, the Office of War Information was established in 1942. They did everything from reviewing screenplays to putting out posters and doing radio reports. In contrast to other groups, the OWI was concerned with ensuring that films conveyed positive messages rather than negative ones. We were going to come out on top in this conflict. A couple things were made very obvious by Casablanca. It was the Nazis who were evil. And the United States was still the hero even when its citizens were flawed. Richard Blaine. An initially skeptical and hopeless individual, the lone American in a metropolis teeming with European refugees, takes up the cause of standing up for dignity. However, he ended up shooting a Nazi, assisting a resistance commander in escaping, and ultimately deciding to join the Free French. Then there's the moving scene where the entire pub joins in singing the French national anthem as the Germans attempt to muffle them. Extremely, even excessively, nationalistic sentiments were conveyed in the film. It is not proven that the government had issues with Casablanca. It's difficult to fathom that they were unhappy with it. But Breen was an entirely unique critic. The script was deeply troubling to him. Set in Morocco, Casablanca follows a group of refugees as they flee to the United States. Humphrey Bogart's gruff and secretive character, Rick Blaine, runs Rick's Cafe, where everyone congregates. The passports of 2 German couriers who were discovered dead in the desert have gone missing. Rick receives the visas from the thief just before he is apprehended. The village is also being visited by Victor Laszlo, commander of the resistance, and Ilsa, his wife. 2 permits are required for their escape, but there's a hitch. A past exists between Rick and Ilsa. She abandoned him at the train station despite their love in Paris. Her husband's death was her worst fear. They must confront their history in Casablanca. Breen expressed his dissatisfaction with the script and Captain Renault's character in a memo he submitted to Jack Warner. The dishonest police chief, Renault, had lines that suggested he wanted anything in return for visas. Because Breen despised them, one of the lines was omitted entirely. Even in a scene where Renault was seen interacting with a Nazi official, he couldn't help but gripe about the car. His point was crystal clear. Renault dealing with women for visa purposes is unacceptable. The head of the studio, Halbia Wallace, disagreed with Breen over the film's conclusion but agreed to remove some scenes depicting corrupt French police officers. The initial script had Rick shoot Strasser in the back in an unheroic manner. The rules against presenting offenders in a sympathetic light were violated by that. Even a Nazi couldn't be killed without a good reason, according to the code. This necessitated a scene adjustment. Now it's clear that Strasser was acting in self-defense when he pointed the gun at Rick. It was later revealed by Wallace that they had to reshoot the entire scene since they filmed the previous ending without Breen's agreement. In the next scene, Ilsa visits Rick in his flat. As soon as Rick declines to assist Laszlo in obtaining the exit visas, this incident takes place. Laszlo is effectively dead in the eyes of the Germans if he remains in Casablanca. Ilsa is aware that Rick possesses the necessary visas. All he needs is Renault's approval. Her determination palpable, she slips inside his apartment to confront him. Rick would not lend a hand because he is still resentful over what transpired in Paris. Ilsa reaches for her rifle, but she holds back her shot since her love for him remains unwavering. They finally lock lips. They continue to speak while the scene cuts ahead. Crucial was the manner in which this scene changed. Even seemingly insignificant editing decisions could have far-reaching consequences in that era. Breen blocked a fade-out that was in the original script, which would have gradually faded away the visuals and sound. A fade-out was a common way for couples of that time to signal that they had just slept together. That was more than simply some clever editing, it was a secret message. This scene in the script was marked by Breen on June 18. That was way too revealing. So what was his plan? Shifted the dissolve to replace the fade-out. Additionally, he was adamant that the following scene not feature any furniture that would give away a secret. After making this adjustment, he thought the film would pass muster with the production code. Casablanca received the official go-ahead for distribution after the filmmakers made the necessary revisions. Production on Casablanca ceased on August 3, 1942, after 59 days on set, 11 days longer than originally planned. The editing for the film, Owen Marks, had been collaborating closely with everyone involved from the beginning. Therefore, he did not squander any time when the filming ceased by assembling the initial cut. No one on set anticipated Casablanca to be a box office smash, despite having an A-list cast and some of Hollywood's top writers. There were hundreds of these films produced annually by the studio system, and this one was no different. In their 1942 review, the New York Times gushed over the script, lauding its witty banter, and vowed not to reveal the ending. Michael Curtis, the film's director, was highly praised for meticulously building tension and evoking strong emotions in viewers. Dooley Wilson's moments at the piano and when the Czech patriot joins the Rix mob in singing La Marseillaise to drown out the Nazis were two of the most moving scenes. When it came to the performance, Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart stood out. In his characteristic cold and heartless performance, Bogart portrayed a man who puts on an act of self-centeredness while concealing a vast reservoir of emotion. He nailed the character's internal conflict. Bergman, on the other hand, was the film's romantic heroine. She was radiant, charming, and entirely authentic. Initially, the release was scheduled for June 1943 by the studio. Casablanca was completely unknown to the majority of Americans. The wartime plot and the A-list actors, Bogart, Claude Rains, Paul Henreid, were adequate, according to Warner Brothers. Things took a dramatic turn on November 8. Operation Torch, a huge military campaign to capture French Morocco and Algeria from Vichy, France, was announced as having been initiated by American and British soldiers. In an effort to reduce Soviet pressure, this new front in the battle against Germany was pivotal, which was embroiled in terrible fighting on the Eastern Front with the Nazis. Casablanca became a media darling overnight. In the midst of a naval showdown with the French, 33,000 American soldiers under the command of General Patton stormed the Moroccan beaches. The timing was absolutely incredible for Warner Brothers. As the Allies seized control of the actual city of Casablanca, they had a film adaptation of the city scripted and ready to go. It was a tremendous amount of free publicity. The studio wasted no time. The initial release plan was cancelled, and a special premiere was set for New York City 2 weeks later. Casablanca, a city filled with immigrants, resistance fighters, and Nazi collaborators, was abruptly transported to the audience as the lights darkened. Rick, the jaded bar owner with a shadowy history, was their encounter. Ilsa was there, caught between her commitment to her husband and her feelings for Rick. They also encountered Victor, the likable resistance leader who was in a desperate state to get away from the Nazis. Special letters of transit, taken from the possession of deceased German soldiers, were necessary for Victor and Ilsa to leave Casablanca. But Ilsa's history with Rick was about to throw everything into chaos when the Nazis showed up and threatened to take Victor to a concentration camp. Everyone in Rick's was crying by the time the mob sang La Marseillaise, overpowering the German soldiers with their rebellious voices. And if that scene wasn't enough to grab you, the climax was. A procession of Free Frenchmen marched down Fifth Avenue before to the beginning of the film. Following the performance, they ascended the stage to serenade a gigantic French flag while singing the national hymn. According to The Hollywood Reporter, the event was more of a patriotic rally than a movie premiere. Even though they were across the water, the events in France had an impact on the people of New York. Casablanca was more than a movie to the Free French, who were still fighting against the Nazis. It was an open letter to the Vichy government, which had supported Hitler. However, the central theme of the film revolved around the displaced souls who were trapped in Casablanca and were compelled to make unimaginable decisions, the refugees. The film depicted the brutality of combat even though it was shot in Hollywood. While Casablanca did well at the box office upon its initial release in the United States, it did not become an overnight sensation. There was an estimated $3.70 million in revenue. Decent, but not spectacular. On January 23, 1943, it was further released to the general public. That date was also not picked at random. It happened on the same day as the famous Casablanca Conference, where Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met. Casablanca was released in the United States in 1943, smack dab in the midst of World War II, but it wasn't until 1952, much after the war had finished, that it was shown to German audiences. And when they did, the film was very different. Warner Brothers transformed it into something entirely new by removing all reference to the Nazis and the conflict. Given that Casablanca revolves around the war and the resistance against the Nazis, that is somewhat outrageous. German film dubbing specialist Niels Daniel Peeler detailed the extensive changes made to the original German version. It was necessary to alter even the most minute aspects. The original film's most moving scene, the one in which the patrons of Rick's bar shout the French national anthem so loudly that it drowns out the Nazis, was cut out. There was even rewriting of certain characters. The courageous resistance fighter Victor Laszlo transformed into the Norwegian scientist Victor Larsen, who was allegedly on the run from the Nazis after making a discovery of something called delta rays. Plus, that wasn't the sole significant alteration. Rick informs the crooked French police officer that Laszlo escaped from a Nazi concentration camp in the original. However, that sentence was changed in the German version to read that Laszlo had escaped from numerous people previously and simply broken out of jail. We deleted any reference to the Nazis and their concentration camps. Warner Brothers had to get the green light from the FSK, Germany's version of the MPAA, before releasing Casablanca in West Germany. According to a German history and film scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, the West German public was not very interested in discussing the most heinous aspects of World War II. In fact, the government and cultural organizations were careful not to depict Nazi figures or scenes. Some were concerned that these portrayals would reawaken previous fascist tendencies, as Kapczynski pointed out. Ultimately, the German dub of Casablanca was 25 minutes condensed from the original. The critical reception was lackluster, but the box office performance was satisfactory. Many others wrote it off as another Ingrid Bergman vehicle from Warner Brothers. However, the authentic Casablanca wasn't shown to German viewers until 1975. Up until then, they had just the modified version.